Welcome to the next in our series on the future of procurement. My name's James Marland, Vice President of Network Growth here at SAP, and I've got with me Andrew Bartolini, the Managing Partner at Ardent Partners.
Hello, James.
So in this session, we're going to talk a little bit about risk and how we can mitigate against it, the different types of risk, and the different ways that procurement teams can try to eliminate risk out of their business best they can. Uh, Last summer, there was a situation where there was a very small company called HEC Electronics, and they were in trouble because they had turned out to be using child labor. Now, no one heard that story, but the story was reported in the press as a supplier of Samsung was found using child labor, and the name of Samsung was associated with child labor, which of course great reputational damage to a very heavily branded company, Samsung, that advertises everywhere. So the idea of suppliers who have poor practices can really damage a brand is really top of mind for some CPOs. So Andrew, what ways can procurement teams mitigate against that kind of concern in their supply chains?
Yeah, I think that one of so globalization has done a vast number of things, right? It has enabled organizations to drive down their costs and their materials and in their goods. It has opened up new markets. It has at the same time increased the competitive landscape in most major industries, I would say certainly, but it's also added several layers of complexity to organizations that have global suppliers that do global sourcing. And the key issue there is risk and the visibility that organizations have into their overall supply chains. And so, there are, you know, in the, decades ago, right, when your supplier was down the lane, right, it was very easy for you to just pop in and, run whatever tests, sort of, kick the tires, whatever whatever analogy you may want to use. It becomes increasingly difficult when your suppliers are half a world away in different time zones and working when you're asleep. And, it starts, I think, at the very outset for chief procurement officers, heads of procurement, and leaders in procurement and supply chain to begin to understand the shift in their businesses first and foremost. And then I think the next step is to begin to define what those potential risks are and the implications of those risks. Because I think with most organizations, one of the challenges with supply risk and why there are not codified best practices is because the risks that exist for each enterprise are unique to that enterprise.
So I was reading some analysis recently that said that managing risk is now becoming of greater concern to purchasing organizations over traditional metrics of savings. Now, the conventional way of doing supplier profiling was once a year, you send an email out, ask them to fill out a few things, check a few boxes, maybe attach a certificate or two, and you stick that in the filing cabinet. But I think that's no longer good enough, right?
No, I think absolutely not. I think it starts with, I guess coming up with a broader supply risk management strategy. I think that many of the challenges that exist for procurement organizations today is the multitude of potential risks that exist and the costs associated with mitigating each and every single one of those in a very singular and finite way, because I think it's important for organizations first to identify the risks, and then taking on risk is not necessarily a bad thing, right? There are reasons why you invest in that small innovative supplier. There are reasons why you make decisions to source from Vietnam or to set up a new procurement center of excellence in Kenya. Those things lead to new relationships. They lead to innovation. They lead to different types of results. But I think at the core, it's the identification of risk and the potential results of something or of those risks being realized, or some event actually being incurred, and having a plan to react or respond to that are really what procurement organizations can do.
So we talked a bit about about reputational risk,
Mhm.
but another type of risk, of course, is supply chain risk itself, being sure that a supplier is always going to be there for me. He's going to always have the correct inventory, be able to respond to my demand, especially as you said, it might be a small supplier. Um, what strategy should I be moving away from single sourcing, or should I be able to keep secondary and tertiary suppliers on standby? What are the right kind of strategies for eliminating those types of risks in the business?
So the management of supply risk and supply chain risk, I think, is something that really is unique to each specific supply chain, right? Are you sourcing from China? Are you sourcing from Southeast Asia? Are you sourcing from the Americas? Are you sourcing from Eastern Europe? And so the proper strategy of, do you sole source, or do you have secondary sources of supply, really depends on the component. It really depends on what your supply chain looks like today, and the risks of having a breakdown with your primary suppliers. Um, when again, many of the challenges that or many of the risks that exist are simply unknown for organizations. And I think that the keys are to for procurement organizations and supply chain leaders to have contingency plans in place, so that they have done the what if scenarios of what if there is a breakdown because of floods in Thailand. What if there is a breakdown because of um, the Fukushima nuclear catastrophe that can is something that's completely unpredictable, right? I mean, I think that's a key element of this, right? If you were to go back to 2008 and you look at a world-class supply management organization like Toyota, ahead of what they were thinking was going to be a pretty significant financial crisis, and they were correct in their estimations. They brought back their basically at the manager level and above, all of their buyers in North America, and they ran dozens of different scenarios as to what would happen if specific suppliers in different regions in the Americas failed, primarily for financial reasons. They had plans in place to drop ship items overnight so that the lines could continue to move forward. Now, when the financial crisis hit in fall of 2008 and carried into 2009, this organization was prepared, right? They had run the scenarios. They were, I think, they were primed and ready to go, and they were very successful in avoiding any supply chain disruptions as caused by any financial concerns or bankruptcy issues in their supply base. They actually, for the first time in North America, were the largest car seller in 2008. So what happens in 2009? There was a mishap in one of their suppliers' software that caused a fairly dramatic recall. And so, the point is that you can never fully anticipate all of the risks that you're exposed to in your supply chain. The key is to have some awareness, to have identified and prioritized the primary ones, and to have plans in place so that you can escalate a response.
So one thing that we've seen is the requirement to have an online availability of suppliers, and sometimes when we show this capability on the Ariba network, the response is, I don't need that. I already got my primary suppliers. But this ability to be able to find secondary suppliers as backups in perhaps different territories than you normally do business with is a great thing. You can then have them as proved, get all the paperwork done, make sure they're connected electronically, so that if you need to switch over, everything's already in place. So purchase orders that used to go out to supplier A can be simply routed to supplier B.
Right. Again, in our earlier conversation, right, when we talk about innovation and we talk about collaboration, from a first things first approach, right, you need to get rid of the transactional noise that often accompanies the initial supplier onboarding and the initial part of a relationship, right? If you can move past those tactical and time consuming and non-value added activities, it allows you to move towards the business at hand, right? And I think when you look at something like supplier discovery, organizations need to be thinking about not just the cost of the item that they're purchasing, but it's the total cost of the relationship, right? If there's going to be a significant undertaking, right, this can be tied to location of supply, but this can also be tied to sort of the technical capabilities of your supplier today, right? If they're
Right.
if they're primed and ready to go, and you need to make a quick switch, and sometimes this is going to be for a supply risk or supply chain disruption reason. Sometimes it's simply going to be that the market has changed and there's new demand and your customers are asking for something else. If you have the ability to make that switch in a seamless way, that's ideal.
Right. So the last really area of risk I'd like to talk about is supply chain finance risk.
Hmm.
So if I'm managing potentially lots of small suppliers, they may be themselves under financial pressures to they may have to hire on additional staff or make rent payments or make other investments, and there's always a danger that they can run into cash problems. So one of the areas that I think is interesting for managing that type of risk is the ability to finance suppliers through the supply chain. And so I can use my cash liquidity as a buyer to pay some suppliers early for a discount, of course,
Sure.
to get them out of a possible cash squeeze.
Mhm. Right. So I think this is an area that is emerging. I think it's an area that presents an extraordinary opportunity or potential, but is one that has not been tapped into simply because in a manual paper-based transaction world, the ability to make an early payment, the ability to make a payment on time, frankly, can be quite difficult, and that places stress and that places pressure on your supply chain, right, from the buyer's perspective. By automating your P2P processes, enabling straight through processing of invoices, you now, an accounts payable department or a P2P team has the opportunity to go and engage with their treasury department to say, is the best use of our cash to pay the supplier today? Should we wait several days? Likewise for suppliers, in a manual world, right? They're spending, significant, a significant amount of their time making inquiries into AP departments and trying to figure out, well, have you even received the invoice, right? If all of this is automated, if all of this is visible, you begin to have the ability to make decisions that benefit your business, and that's really something that's only now just starting to emerge with the, really what we've seen a very strong uptick in the use and adoption of e-invoicing.
Yeah, because if you have e-invoicing linked to procurement, then what was typically a 45-day payment terms, quite frankly, the accounts payable department spent like 44 days just getting it ready for payment.
Right.
So it was there was no time at the end. If you can eliminate that and basically be immediately ready to pay, then you've got 40 odd days to speak to a supplier about, okay, now let's talk.
That's right.
And so you have a lot more time. Plus, you get visibility into your treasury department a month earlier of a payables liability on the books.
Right. When you start to think about the entirety, right. So James, when you and I started in this industry, right, people talked about procure to pay, P2P. And there was, frankly, there was no contemplation of anything that happened after the purchase order was delivered, right? You may have been able to flip it and work that way, but accounts payable and the invoicing process was a secondary thought, if at all considered. The reality is that organizations are now looking more broadly at the full source to settle process, right? From an Ardent Partners research perspective, we've always looked at the entirety of that process. We look at the full relationship that you have with your suppliers, and that cuts across understanding their spend, understanding their business, sourcing, going through and contracting a relationship, buying against that contract, and then managing the invoice process as well as managing performances and managing risk. All of these things are coming together. Now, it's still the exception and not the rule to have that process fully automated. It's still the exception and not the rule to have that process fully standardized and seamless. But organizations now, I think, do see that as the next step in managing not just supply risk, but in managing relationships and enabling better conversations and enabling smarter decisions that can benefit both sides, like supply chain finance.
Okay, great. So that's really Andrew sort of summarized the really different components of risk. So there's sort of three areas really: reputational risk, management of my suppliers' profile, what they do, how it affects my own reputation. Supply chain disruption risk, suppliers not being there for me due to either natural disasters or themselves going out of business. And then finally, supply chain financing, which is a way for me to use my liquidity to finance liquidity throughout the supply chain through early pay discounts. Okay, thanks very much, Andrew.
Thank you, Jess.
And look forward to hearing you on our next segment.